the spring of 1953, a team of young athletes from the Naval Academy stood at attention while 4,800 fellow classmates marched by, saluting them with 3 cheers, 5 separate times. It was the only time in the history of the Academy that a pass and review parade has been held to honor students who are still enrolled in school, an honor usually reserved for admirals, kings, and presidents. The athletes were the Navy varsity crew, a team considered by many to be the greatest American rowing team that has ever raced. They were called the Great Eight. It was here on the Severn River that the legendary Great Eight rowing team came together under the command of a new head coach. When Rusty Callow arrived in 1951, Navy hadn't had a winning season in years. His first year was no exception. The young men he would eventually mold into champions were rowing in the junior varsity and freshman boats that year, and they'd become more accustomed to losing than to winning.
The first year I rowed, we never won a single race. Not a single race. We lost every race.
We went to Marietta for the national championships, and it was a total disaster. All told, the Ohio River went into a flood situation, and over a period of 3 or 4 days, as I recall, there were about 17 boats that sank from various things. They were hit by telephone poles, dead pigs, outhouses, trees, and each other floating down the river.
It has been dubbed as the worst disaster since Pearl Harbor by many sports writers, since Navy sunk all 3 boats.
Old Man River, the beautiful Ohio, that is, turns the 49th regatta of the Intercollegiate Rowing Association into the Isle of Lost Ships. 3 of the Navy shells were scuttled by the 6-mile current and floating debris. In spite of Old Devil River, 12 varsity entries flash away to a fast-beat start. In the lineup are the giants of rowing, California and Washington, which for 13 years have ruled the event.
In the junior varsity race, we took about 2 strokes and hit some object in the water, and down we went. They fished us out of the Ohio River, and the shell itself was completely smashed. And the race was over with 3 strokes.
Some sports writer in Chicago came out after the races were over and wrote an article about us and said if these were the future admirals of the United States Navy, the country would do well to mothball the entire fleet.
After Marietta, Coach Callow decided he'd had enough of losing. At the beginning of the 52 season, he did something radical and unexpected. He dismissed the returning varsity crew and handed the oars to a group of underclassmen, 6 sophomores and 2 juniors from the previous year's teams.
At Annapolis, which is at the north end of Chesapeake Bay, the winters are usually pretty tough, and Navy crews traditionally never get on the water till around the middle of February. They had, I'm told, the first open winter, so-called, in 50 years, and they were told by my father that as long as the weather held, they would row around the island every night. Well, that's about a 5-mile or 6-mile row, all at a low stroke, 18 to 20 strokes a minute, and nothing will teach a crew how to ride the keel of the boat, which is all important mechanically, as much as rowing like that, long distances at a low stroke.
The first race of the 52 season pitted Navy against Yale. the defending Eastern League champions. Nearly all of Yale's championship team was returning. Thousands of spectators gathered on the banks of the Housatonic River to watch the races.
Our coach had told us, you're going to have to really roll your guts out to beat these guys. They're good.
Yeah, Rusty's instructions were go out and beat the hell out of them. But we went there, and you have to remember that they were the defending Eastern champions from the year before. And we were just coming off the Marietta debacle. And when we got up there, they literally laughed at us when we walked into the boathouse. I've never forgotten that.
But we lined up and took off, and in fact heard a lot of music and partying and so forth along the shoreline as we raced down the river.
And we had been coached very carefully by Rusty. The race course is in the shape of an S. And we knew that because of the lane picking that we had, we were going to be on the inside of the first turn and on the outside of the second. So the inside curve being the shortest, it was natural we would take water off these guys. And we expected them to do the same on us on the second curve. Well, we took water on the first curve, we got to the second, and we opened it up even further. And I don't really know what happened to Yale. They just sort of collapsed.
Halfway through, we were, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 lengths ahead. Yale was very far behind.
And by the time we get down to the finish line, the camera that took a picture of us in the photo finish, Yale wasn't in the picture. And we actually stopped and coasted across the finish line unknowingly. And the people on the bank didn't take too kindly to this. In fact, they started throwing beer bottles and whiskey bottles. They had to call the Connecticut police to clear the area to let us in.
Fight, 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 fight for the Navy. Big team in Navy gold and blue.
It's a tradition in crew that the losing team give their shirts to the winners after the race. The victory shirts piled up for Navy that season as they went on undefeated to beat Princeton, Wisconsin, Penn, Harvard, MIT, Syracuse, Cornell, Boston, California, Washington, Stanford, and Columbia. Callow believed that the key to a winning crew is the men themselves. He agreed wholeheartedly with Harvard Athletic Director Tom Bowles, who said, "I have seen almost every conceivable system of rowing win major crew races. So rowing style is not the answer. The controlling factor is the men in the shell." The legendary Great Eight were an unlikely group of football and basketball players, farmers and scholars. All but one had never lifted an oar or seen a racing shell before arriving at the academy. At bow was Frank Shakespeare, a basketball player from Dover, Delaware. He went out for crew after being cut from the academy basketball team. His coach said Frank was simply the best bow man he had ever coached.
I didn't even know what crew was, or team rowing. What I knew about rowing was going out into a boat into a bay and doing some crabbing and fishing.
At the number 2 position was Willie Fields from Forsyth, Georgia.
The two-man Willie Fields is now gone, was, in my father's opinion, the toughest, not the strongest, the toughest man physically and mentally in the crew.
The number 3 man was Jim Dunbar, the smallest of the crew at 6 feet and 175 pounds.
I had been beaten up playing football a little bit, and this is when I got my dare to go out for a hard sport. My roommate was tired of hearing me bellyache about sprained ankles, I guess, and he dared me to go out for a tough sport. I asked him what that was, thinking it might be lacrosse that he's playing, and he said, no, it's crew. And I asked him why he wasn't out there, and he said, it's too tough for him. Takes a strong back and a weak mind, and I took exception to that, went out and liked it.
At number 4 was Dick Murphy, an all-state tackle out of New Jersey, until a knee injury ended his football career.
And that's when I ran into Rusty Callow, and he thought I might have some natural ability, and told me if I was willing. He told me one day, he said, "You're big and you're strong and you're clumsy as hell." He said, "You may be a halfway decent football player, but maybe I can make something out of you as an oarsman."
In the number 5 position was Bob Detweiler, a football and basketball player out of Illinois who didn't know the meaning of the word quit.
I'd never seen a shell or even heard of a crew race before, so it was virtually an unknown sport for me before I went to the Naval Academy.
In the number 6 seat was Henry Proctor, a farm boy from Kansas. At 6 feet 6 inches, he was the largest member of the team and the best technical oarsman on the crew.
Well, I had wanted to play football, but I hadn't been approached or talked to by anybody from the football organization, so I decided, well, I'll go see what this rowing sport is like.
The number 7 man was Wayne Fry, who had played football and basketball. Wayne was the strongest man in the crew and someone you would definitely want on your side in a street fight.
Never aspired to be a sweep type rower till I got to the Naval Academy.
At stroke was Ed Stevens, the only member of the crew who had rowed before coming to the academy. Ed could go off the mark at 44 strokes a minute, a rare ability in a stroke oar.
The importance of a stroke in a racing crew is akin to a baseball team having a good pitcher. The rest of the crew takes their timing from him, and he is the one that has to do most of the thinking, particularly if he's a good stroke. If he's a good athlete but doesn't have too much between the ears, then the coxswain takes over and does the thinking. Stevens had it all. Stevens could row high, he could get his crew off the mark and leave other crews quickly.
The coxswain, Dave Manring, was a highly intelligent, no-nonsense leader, the only senior on a predominantly sophomore crew. The coach of the Great 8 crew was Rusty Callow. He assumed command of the Navy teams after a long coaching career at Washington and Pennsylvania. At a military academy steeped in regimented tradition, Rusty was a burst of unorthodox color.
He was always in trouble with the administration at the Naval Academy because we had mealtime at, say, 7 o'clock in the evening. But his boats, he took them out and rowed them, and when he came back, he came back.
The boathouse, particularly as freshmen, was a great place for us to be because all of the upper class, lower class routines were out the door there. Rusty wouldn't tolerate it, and we were very thankful for that as plebes our first year anyway.
He was the grand old man of the river. He always had his windbreaker on and his floppy hat and a megaphone, and eyes like an eagle. He could see you from wherever he was on the river, so you didn't dare goof off. He always knew when you were working or not working. He was really like a father to all of us, and we would have rowed till we dropped dead for this gentleman.
If you could line up 8 golfers and get them to coordinate their swing so they'd be able to all swing together, hit the ball together, and finish together, and to be able to do that 32 times a minute, then you have some idea of the kind of coordination it requires in rowing to get 8 guys to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time.
We were probably on the water by about 3:45, and we rowed till dark. And with Rusty's system, we really had to earn our seat every week. Nobody had anything locked up. If you made the varsity on Friday, there was no guarantee you were going to be there Monday. It was always performance-based.
You're starting a race essentially with a 62-foot boat with 8 men that weigh 180 pounds average, and a coxswain that weighs 110 if you're lucky, 120 if you're unlucky, and so that is a lot of dead weight to get up and moving. And
To go from dead stop up to your rowing speed of about 12 miles an hour is a difficult thing because you have no momentum.
So it's a very short stroke for the first, and then each stroke successively becomes a little longer. So about the time you get out to the 10th stroke, you're taking a full bite of the water.
Rusty practiced this. We'd go out and we'd do 20 or 30 of these, and we'd take 1 stroke and let the boat glide, take 3/4 of a slide and let it glide. And then we'd take the first 3 strokes and let it glide. And then he'd critique us on how that we could improve this, and then get your hands way a little faster and get a little better balance. And we worked on this and worked on it so that it was a distinct, one of the distinctions we had Most of the other coaches would say if you don't keep up with them on the first 30 strokes, you're going to lose the race.
Many of the other crews would take 10 strokes for a racing start. We took as many strokes as it took to get out in front.
When you get them in view without turning your head, you know you're ahead of them, and then you just sit on them. And if you can, you drop the stroke and kill them, stroke at a time. And when they know that they're rowing above you and they're not gaining on you, psychologically, you beat them.
One of the questions I most frequently ask about our crew is, what was the secret to our success? There really wasn't any secret at all. We rowed against a junior varsity that probably could have beaten most varsity teams in the United States. And we rowed against them every day. And it's easy enough to put it all out when you're in a race, but it's really tough to do that as a matter of course in a practice. And I can remember many days of coming back just from a normal practice and being so tired I could hardly get out of the boat. And I guess if I were to demonstrate kind of how that goes, when you arrive at the dock, you have somebody help you get the oar out of the oarlock on that side, and you try to crawl out of the boat, and your legs just don't work very well, and your arms are completely weak, and you end up just something, if I can poorly demonstrate, you just end up kind of rolling out of the boat as best you can, and just kind of just pulling your head down and wondering where the next breath was coming from. And you just sort of just sat there for a moment and try to catch your breath and realize that you've made it through another practice. And I think that was probably our biggest advantage, that we were able to leave it out on the water every practice. Every time we went out, it was that way. And all 8 men learned to do that just as a matter of course.
Having snatched the Eastern League Championship from Yale, Navy set its sights on the Nationals.
The IRA National Championships are sort of like the Kentucky Derby of rowing. You go for all the beans.
This was the first time a national championship had been rowed on Lake Onondaga. They said if they can make 16 minutes, they'll have a good time for 3 miles. We came in at 15 minutes and 8 seconds.
I weighed out at about 200 pounds, and after the race, I weighed in at 189. And the boat was literally awash in perspiration. At that point, you're almost into the point of what we used to call the purple grapefruit. And that's at the end of a real long, hard race, somewhere up in the upper foreground, you begin to get a little purple spot that starts to grow larger and larger. I think it's the beginning of passing out. That day in '52, we had a clean sweep. That is, all 3 Navy boats won. We won in all classes. So we came home with all the medals, all the cups, and all the shirts.
With the national championship in hand and still undefeated, they moved on to the Olympic trials.
I don't think every one of us got a good night's sleep. I think we were all really full of butterflies because we knew the importance of the race.
And we had decided before the race, since it was a terribly hot weather and high humidity, and we were all so skinny we didn't have a pound of fat among the 8 of us. And we decided to sort of take it easy that day and just row whatever we had to row to stay out in front.
California was over in lane 1 or 2 in the lee of a very high bank. We were out in lane 6 or 7, and where we were, it was literally because of the prevailing winds. We were rowing on white caps, and they were rowing on what essentially looked like a mirror.
As we got to the last half of the race, California began to move on us because it was very important to come in second in that race in order to get into the finals. So the real race was between California and Wisconsin for that second place.
At the very end, maybe the last 10 or 15 strokes, the coxswain panicked a little bit and said, "We really have to row."
And when we went across that finish line, it was just in doubt who had won that race until they had developed some film and we had won the race by less than a couple of feet. And after the race was over, we had time to think that one over. We decided there's going to be no more of this. I was captain of the crew, and we called the guys together and talked about it, and we said, from now on, it's going to be all out. Every time that you row, it's going to be all out.
And then when we got into the finals of that race, we started out at a high stroke, and When I heard poor Rusty was saying, they got to settle more, they got to settle more, they're not going to make it all the way, they're not going to make it all the way. But we made it all the way, and we really poured it on, and we were all happy, and I think that's the best race we ever rode.
We won going away with a length and a half open water. They took pictures at the finish line, and we were the only people there, nobody else.
The Cinderella team from Annapolis had won the most coveted position in racing, the right to represent the United States at the Olympic Games.
The curtain rises on the 1952 Olympics, 15th of the great international sport festivals. Little Finland is host this time to athletes from all parts of the world. The Americans, defending champions, are eager for a test of strength, and all signs point to a thrilling Olympiad. The curtain rises at Helsinki.
This was the first time that the Olympic athletes flew to an Olympic Games. All the others had gone by ship.
We went over with the basketball team, and I remember that when we got off the plane in Helsinki, they thought we were the basketball team because we're all so tall, and the basketball players were still back on the plane. And we explained to the guys who were interviewing us, said, "No, we're not big enough to play that game. Those guys are still in the machine here."
The visiting athletes travel without charge on Helsinki's trolleys. A special bus takes them to their quarters in Olympic Village at Kapula, 6 miles away. At the entrance gate to the village, differences of politics, race, and religion are checked outside, just as in ancient Greece when even wars were suspended during the Olympic Games.
We felt a tremendous sense of pride of representing not only the United States, but the United States Navy.
The Russians were in the height of their segregation and Cold War tactics at that time, and they wouldn't even let their athletes come to town. They were segregated in an Olympic Village, well separated.
The Russians are participating in the games, but they brought their Iron Curtain with them. With their satellite comrades, they have their own quarters in a technical school dormitory at Otaniemi. Pictures of Stalin adorn the walls, and sentries give the camp a warlike atmosphere.
This was the first time that the Russians were in the Olympics since the Russian Revolution.
They were going to come out in 48, and they felt they weren't ready as a team, so they were going to make the massive effort in 52.
The athletes lose no time getting down to business. Last-minute preparations before the games. Here, the unbeaten American crew from Annapolis carries its shell back from the water. Trained fingers wash down the light, delicately constructed boat.
The shells were stored in some tents out on grassy areas, and the tent next to us belonged to the Russian crew. And the Russians came over early on to make our acquaintances and also to look at our equipment.
We didn't know anything about them, but they had heard about us. And we understood that they had been rowing together as a group for a number of years.
In some of the pre-game analysis of who would to watch, I don't think Russia was even mentioned, but the Russians came over and they asked if they could go out and row with us.
And Rusty wasn't terribly keen on that idea, but somehow we got roped into having a racing start with them. Just not a race, but we'll go out and we'll both go off the blocks together and then see what happens.
That is something that's never done in the States. The crews stay totally away from each other.
Well, our style of rowing is a racing start, you settle, you row the body of the race, and then you come on with a strong finish. The Russians apparently were going to row like a clock spring. You just row as hard as you can, as fast as you can, as long as you can, and you wear out. And hopefully you wear out after you cross the finish line.
And they just kept right on going, you know, and like they were rowing a full race, and so they pulled out ahead of us. And I think they felt real good about it. They felt like they could really beat us, whereas we settled down to our normal racing beat.
I remember when we settled, and then we stopped and looked at them, and we kind of talked, and I guess it was with Jim Dunbar, and I said, boy, if they can row 2,000 meters like that, they're going to beat us. And he just looked at me and kind of nodded his head, and he said, well, like Rusty used to say, we're going to have a boat race and find out.
The rowing team of the United States did not march in the opening ceremony because our event was the first one of the games.
And Rusty really didn't want us walking around, parading around for 2 or 3 hours and standing out in the rain on your feet all day. So he arranged sort of a dispensation that we got some tickets to sit up in the grandstand and watch everybody else march.
I don't know that I regret that, but I have some misgivings now. Maybe I should have been one of the marchers. But at the time, I think we were very thankful that we didn't have to, because we had to stand in the rain for a couple of hours. Now, when you get into the heats, you're not concerned about anybody else. You're concerned about concentrating on what you have to do.
The first heat, Great Britain came in second. They were one of the big crews that we were worried about, but we were able to best them. And it was by open water, not by inches. The second heat we rode in, Russia came in second.
The Russians' rowing style was different than anything that I had ever seen in the United States. The Russians did not feather the oars. Normally when you row, you pull through with your blade in the water, and then you feather the oar and bring it back down so it's within an inch or two of the water. Normally that's what you do. You snap the blade up on the catch, put it in, and pull it through again. When the Russians rowed, they put their oar in like so, and they pulled it through, and they never feathered at all. They brought it up out of the water and carried it back, sometimes as high as 3 or 4 feet above the water. And it wasn't coordinated at all. I mean, not everybody brought their oar back 3 feet up. Some brought it back low, some brought it back high. So it looked like a thrashing machine almost, the way they rowed. And if you rowed into a headwind, there was like having 8 sails out there. In addition to that, they had a coxswain that weighed 165 pounds. He was their coach. And our coxswain weighed about 100 pounds. And so that means they were carrying like a 50-pound bag of sand in their boat. It's like a big handicap.
I think I felt more confident for the finals than I did for the opening heat over there, because we were then getting used to the competition, and we had felt them out, and we knew what we could do, and we knew how we could break their back.
We all felt that we should win that race. Given you're not going to break an oar, given you're not going to sink like we did at Marietta, and given that we would row our normal, good race with a good racing start and no accident, we should win that race. We all felt that way.
When we go to the starting line, we back up into our stake boat, and the stake boat operator holds very carefully the back of the boat to make sure he doesn't push us or pull us or whatever, but that aligns all the bows so everybody starts evenly.
Once the referee sees that everybody is generally pointed in that direction, that's when he says, "Et vous prêts?" And everybody, none of the coxswains holds up their hands, partez, and you're off.
When we took off with our racing start, which we had customarily moved out and won our race at the first 40 or 50 strokes, we were usually a length out in front. We didn't gain anything on this Russian crew. They were over there flaying away with their oars, and they stayed right alongside of us. They didn't have anything on us, but they weren't behind. And every time we punched for 10 strokes, they did the same thing, and they stayed right alongside. And we got down to the 1,000-meter mark. And we weren't sure that we were going to win that race.
So Rusty and I were standing at the finish line. And we could hear over the public address system. We got a report of the race as it went along. And according to the broadcasters, everybody was rowing 36.
And our coxswain was yelling at us, says, "Let's don't wait till the last 20 strokes to win the race. Let's win it here." And as I recall, we ended up taking 10 strokes punch, and then we took 10 more, and we moved out about a half a length on them. And then they never quite caught back up after that. They moved up a little bit on us, but I think it was down to such serious rowing at that point that every guy was punching every stroke all the way from the last half of that race.
The steady, controlled beat of the Navy leaves open water behind as they skim past the finish flag. A full 6 seconds before the red-jerseyed Russians pull up. Pressing the Russians hard is the Australian Shell, which finished third.
We all went down to the floats and welcomed these guys when they came in. And it was a moment of great joy, of course.
I can recall when I got out of that boat and stood up there, I felt dizzy and I felt like I was going to faint for a few seconds. And looking back at that film, when we were standing on the dock, I could see that I was breathing very hard and probably hyperventilating.
The Olympic medals were presented to us in a different fashion than they have been traditionally presented, in that they were given to us in little jewelry boxes rather than on red, white, and blue ribbons that they place around your neck.
A Finnish lady came by, and an official from the Olympic Committee came by and gave us this particular gold medal. The medal itself, the front of it is common for all Olympic Games. The back of it is designed by the country that sponsors the Olympics. So you may see different backs, but the front is quite similar. It says Helsinki, the 15th Olympics.
There were a smattering of people in the stands, not very many cameras, not much press at all. We climbed back in our shell and rode off with our awards in the boat, in some water. It just seemed like an anticlimax to something. We didn't really realize what all had happened. The national anthem brought some tears. But it was all a day's work.
We decided that we would give our practice shirts, the ones with Helsinki on them, and the rowing team shirts. Not our good rowing final shirts, but the practice shirts. We handed those to the Russians in a feeling of goodwill that we wanted to do something for them and try to get a little more friendly. And I guess it was about that time we had the invitation extended to us to go out and visit the training camp.
As far as I know, our team was the only ones to ever get in that village. We were really feted with food and entertainment. For example, they had a segment of the Bolshoi Ballet there. They had the national champion balalaika player.
In other words, we were wined and dined, filet mignon, the works.
I would have to admit that our being on a strict training regimen for such a long period of time, and just to satisfy the requirements of our being gracious guests, we partook of a lot of vodka. And some of us got a little bit out of control, but everything was kept in good taste, and we had a whale of a good time.
But this exchange of ideas, I think, was a real positive thing. And to me, that's what the Olympics is all about.
With McCarthyism running rampant, fraternizing with the enemy would come back to haunt at least one member of the American crew.
I was a candidate for Rhodes Scholarship from my state of Kentucky, one of two. And when I went to the district and through the interview process there, I was asked a lot of questions about my association with the Russians, and I just said it like it was. I said, those folks are just the ordinary folks that we associated with, have the same ideas and goals and personal requirements as we as Americans have. Naturally, the governing regime is quite different. They didn't like that answer, and I have it in writing that's the reason I was not chosen.
After the Olympics, Life magazine wrote an article entitled, "A Great Eight Rose for Navy." The name stuck. They won 29 consecutive races, the longest winning streak in American crew history. The previous record set by Harvard was 12. After rowing together only one season, they won the Olympic gold medal. In 3 years of racing, they never lost a race.
And I remember that very well, because my Cornell cruise, along with all the other crews, chased the Navy crew for 4 years and never could beat them. I think without a doubt it was probably the greatest American crew that was ever rowed.
After graduating from the academy, Frank Shakespeare was assigned to submarines in the Navy line, but soon resigned to become a high school math teacher in Maryland. Willie Fields became a career naval officer and later retired to his family home near Atlanta, Georgia. An accident claimed Willie's life in 1992. Dick Murphy went into the Air Force, but eventually resigned to open and manage his own international electronics company. Ed Stevens spent some time in the Navy Submarine Division before receiving a master's degree in nuclear engineering from MIT. Jim Dunbar, Wayne Fry, Henry Proctor, and Bob Detweiler went into the Air Force. They all retired as colonels after flying combat missions in Vietnam. Between them, they received 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 13 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Purple Heart, 33 Air Medals, and each a Legion of Merit. Every 5 years, the Great Eight gather from all over the country for a reunion. At their last meeting, they talked about the rowing brotherhood that has kept them close for so many years.
Those fellows are closer to me than my brothers. I hate to use the word bonding because it's so terribly overused these days. Everybody bonds to everything about everything. But there was something that was developed over those years and over that close contact. We lived together, we ate together, we slept together, we traveled together, we were in the service together. It was always together.
There seems to be more of a deep feeling for one another on a rowing team than any other sport I've ever associated with. There's something about the sport and that participation together that makes it unique.
There's no way to express in words how I feel about all these guys. I think they're great.
It's always good to get back together. And when we were able, of course, I don't think we're going to be probably able to many more times, if ever, get back in the boat and go out and
Dave Menring died of a heart ailment in 1990. During his career as a Navy officer, he turned down command of a carrier rather than be at sea while his children were still at home. It was a decision that probably cost him an admiral's rank. With the same spirit of brotherhood that propelled them to victory years before, the Great Eight solemnly fulfilled Dave's last request. They stepped into a Navy shell and, with the coxswain's seat empty, rode down the race course at Annapolis, scattering Dave's ashes along his beloved Severn River. A few years before his death, Coach Rusty Callow expressed his feelings about this remarkable sport called crew. He wrote, "To me, the finest spectacle in sport is to watch a crew when its members are close to exhaustion, rise to the challenge, and go out beyond themselves. If you've never been part of such an effort, you can never fully appreciate what it accomplishes in the minds and hearts of its participants. The individual oarsman never forgets such an experience. And in that great common effort lies the real secret of the almost religious feeling oarsmen have for their sport and the affinity they feel for one another. Such effort cannot attract or hold the man who thinks of quitting when the going gets rough. From sincere, unselfish effort come the real rewards in life. Rowing offers this to its participants.